The room feels heavier than it should. Not dark, not tense, just weighted. Like something has been placed there and left behind. The air carries a quiet pressure, the kind that makes people lower their voices without knowing why. Everything looks ordinary at first. Clean surfaces, familiar objects, nothing dramatic, nothing obviously hidden. And yet, the space feels full, as if it remembers things that are no longer visible. People move carefully here, not stiff, just aware. They place objects back where they found them. They avoid certain corners without realizing it. They do not linger too long in silence, but they also do not fill it too fast. There is someone in the room who listens more than they speak. They do not ask questions directly. They do not interrupt. They let others talk at their own pace. When people share small details, the collector does not react much. No surprise, no judgment, just attention. That attention feels steady. People tend to reveal more when nothing pushes them. They relax when they are not challenged. They explain themselves when they think they are safe. The room allows that feeling to grow. You notice how conversations drift. Personal details surface casually, things that were not planned to be said. Small confessions, minor complaints, half-finished thoughts that slip out before they can be taken back. The collector does not respond to these moments with emotion. They respond with memory. They remember who said what, when it was said, what was avoided, what changed afterward. They store details quietly without signaling their importance. That is what makes the room feel dense. Nothing is repeated. Nothing is shared again. People leave the room lighter than they arrived. They feel heard. They feel understood. They feel relieved. They do not realize they have left something behind. The collector remains unchanged. The room itself feels like a container. Words enter it, but they do not echo back. They settle. They stay where they land. The walls feel closer once something personal has been said, even if no one notices the shift. Time behaves differently here. Moments stretch when people speak honestly. Silence feels longer after a disclosure. The room seems to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in possession. There is no threat in the atmosphere, no pressure to confess, no sense of danger. That is what makes the exchange easy. Trust forms quietly when nothing is demanded. The collector does not promise anything. They do not offer comfort. They do not ask for clarity. Their restraint creates space, and space invites disclosure. People talk because they want to be known. They want to release something. They want to feel lighter. The room allows that feeling without resistance, but nothing truly leaves. Objects in the room feel still, as if they have learned how to listen. A chair angled slightly toward the center, a surface cleared of distractions. Everything feels prepared, not staged, but ready. When someone stops speaking, there is often a pause, not awkward, just long enough to notice. In that pause, the weight settles further. The collector does not fill it. When the room empties, nothing looks different. No visible change, no trace of what passed through. And yet, something has accumulated. The room now knows more than it did before, and the collector carries it forward quietly, without urgency, without display. What has been given will not be spent quickly. It has value because it is kept. This is where Jung would slow down and look beneath the surface, not at what is shared, but at what is kept. Not at what people say openly, but at what they choose to carry in silence. The collector does not look dangerous. They often look calm, attentive, present. They create a sense of safety by not reacting too much. Nothing shocks them. Nothing seems too heavy. That is why people speak. Jung would notice that this calm is not emptiness, it is containment. The collector has learned how to hold things, not objects, inner material, words, confessions, weak moments, small truths that people do not usually give away. These are not gathered aggressively, they are offered. People reveal themselves when they believe nothing will be done with what they share. Jung would recognize the shadow at work here. Everyone has parts of themselves they do not want to see: doubts, resentments, envy, fear, shame. These parts look for somewhere safe to land. When the collector listens without judgment, the shadow feels invited. People speak about things they have never fully faced, not because they are pushed, but because the space allows it. The collector does not interrupt. They do not correct. They do not reassure too quickly. That silence gives the shadow room to step forward. Jung would note how this exchange feels relieving for the one who speaks. The weight lifts, the tension drops. They feel lighter. They mistake this feeling for resolution. But nothing has been integrated. The shadow has been moved, not understood. It has changed location. It now lives outside the person who shared it, and it lives with someone else. The collector does not absorb these shadows emotionally. They store them. They remain unchanged. This difference matters. Jung would see how power begins to form here, not through intention, but through imbalance. One person empties, the other accumulates. The collector's inner world becomes crowded, not chaotic, but dense, full of fragments of other people's hidden selves. They carry knowledge that was never meant to circulate. This creates a quiet separation. The collector knows more about others than others know about them. That difference builds distance. Distance builds control. Jung would also notice that the collector is not free from their own shadow. In fact, collecting often begins as a defense, a way to avoid looking inward by focusing outward. When attention is always directed at others, the self remains protected. The collector may believe they are simply a good listener, a safe presence. But Jung would ask what is being avoided, what personal material never enters the room, what is never shared. Often, the collector's own shadow is guarded carefully. Their calm is a boundary. Their silence is a wall. They trade vulnerability for information. Jung would see the risk in this pattern. The shadow does not disappear when it is ignored. It grows heavier when it is fed indirectly. Carrying the unresolved material of others can deepen a sense of inner control, but it also hardens the self. The collector begins to see people as containers of useful truth rather than equals. Not consciously, quietly. People become sources. Jung would not call this evil. He would call it unbalanced, a psyche that holds too much and releases too little. Over time, the collector may feel detached, superior, isolated, not because they seek power, but because power has settled in their hands unnoticed. Secrets become weight. Weight becomes structure. Structure becomes identity. And once identity forms around what is hidden, letting go becomes difficult. Jung would stay with that tension. The place where listening turns into possession, where understanding turns into storage, where the shadow is no longer faced, only collected. That is where the real danger begins. This is where Nietzsche would grow alert. Not alarmed, interested. He would sense that something subtle is happening, something that wears a calm face but changes the balance between people. Nietzsche would not ask how the collector feels about secrets. He would ask what secrets do to the collector. Knowledge is never neutral. Knowing more than others always creates distance, and distance, for Nietzsche, is never innocent. The collector does not use secrets loudly. They do not threaten. They do not expose. They do not boast. That restraint is exactly what Nietzsche would watch. Power that does not need to show itself is the most comfortable kind. Nietzsche would notice how the collector's posture toward others changes over time. Slowly, almost invisibly. When you know something hidden about someone, you stop meeting them as an equal. Even if you act polite, even if you stay kind, you begin to stand slightly above without saying so. The collector may tell themselves they are being respectful, trustworthy, loyal, but Nietzsche would listen for something else, a quiet sense of elevation, a feeling of standing on firmer ground than others. Knowing secrets can feel like clarity, like insight, like seeing behind masks. Nietzsche would question that feeling. He would ask whether it is truth or advantage. Morality enters here. The collector often believes they are doing the right thing by keeping what they know. They protect others by staying silent. They frame restraint as virtue. Nietzsche would not argue with that directly. He would simply observe how morality becomes useful. Silence begins to feel noble. Control feels justified. Distance feels earned. The collector does not need to lie. They do not need to manipulate openly. Their knowledge already shifts the field. When they speak, words carry extra weight. When they stay quiet, the silence feels heavy. Others sense it, even if they cannot explain why. Nietzsche would notice how quickly people defer to those who seem calm and knowing. How easily certainty attracts obedience. How often restraint is confused with wisdom. The collector benefits from this confusion. They appear measured, superior in self-control, less reactive, less emotional. These traits are praised, valued, trusted. Nietzsche would see how this praise feeds power, but he would also see the danger. When knowledge becomes identity, equality disappears. The collector no longer meets people where they are. They meet them where they stand above, not aggressively, not cruelly, quietly. Nietzsche would say this is where values shift. What was once shared, human weakness becomes material. What was once vulnerability becomes currency. The collector may never spend it, but owning it changes how they see the world. People become readable, predictable, slightly smaller. Nietzsche would not moralize this. He would not say it is wrong. He would say it is revealing. It reveals how easily power hides inside virtue, how easily restraint becomes dominance, how easily being better replaces being equal. The collector may still act kindly, they may still listen, they may still appear safe. But Nietzsche would notice that something has hardened. The collector does not need approval anymore. They already have leverage. This is not revenge, not cruelty. It is comfort, the comfort of standing above without effort. Nietzsche would warn silently here, not with advice, but with a question. What happens when knowing becomes the main source of worth? When secrecy replaces strength, when control replaces growth, when power comes not from creating, but from holding. The collector stands very still in this place, calm, certain, elevated. Nietzsche would see that stillness and recognize it, not as wisdom, but as a quiet will to power, dressed in silence. This is where Machiavelli would stop listening to intentions and start watching consequences. He would not care how the collector describes themselves. He would look at what changes around them over time. Secrets to Machiavelli are not emotional material. They are assets. The collector may never plan to use what they gather. They may even believe they never will. Machiavelli would not argue with that belief. He would simply observe how possession alone alters balance. When one person knows more than others, options shift, choices narrow, Silence gains value. Machiavelli would notice how the collector becomes someone people move carefully around, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. People do not know what the collector knows, that not knowing creates restraint. Restraint creates influence. The collector does not need to remind anyone of what they hold. The possibility is enough. Power works best when it does not need to announce itself. Machiavelli would watch how timing changes. The collector speaks less, but when they do, the moment feels chosen. Words land heavier, pauses stretch longer. Others begin to fill the silence with explanations. This is not manipulation in the loud sense. It is positioning. Machiavelli would see how the collector gains leverage simply by waiting, by letting others reveal themselves first, by never spending information too early. Secrets lose value when they are used. They gain value when they are kept. The collector understands this instinctively. They do not trade secrets openly. They do not threaten exposure. They allow people to imagine consequences on their own. That imagination does more work than any direct action could. Machiavelli would call this efficient. Over time, people begin to adjust around the collector. They share less freely. They choose words carefully. They preemptively defend themselves. Control spreads without instruction. The collector becomes a quiet reference point, not a leader, not an authority, a presence that shapes behavior indirectly. Machiavelli would notice how loyalty changes here. It is no longer based on trust, but on caution. People stay close because distance feels risky. Silence becomes a bond. The collector may still appear calm, neutral, fair, but Machiavelli would see the structure forming beneath that surface. Power does not need cruelty. It needs asymmetry. The collector holds asymmetry in pure form, knowledge on one side, exposure on the other. Even if exposure never happens, the imbalance remains. Machiavelli would also see the trap. Information ages, context changes. People move on. Secrets that are never used can lose relevance. The collector must keep collecting to maintain position. So the habit deepens. Listening becomes strategy. Memory becomes inventory. The collector's inner world turns into storage, not of objects, but of leverage. Machiavelli would not condemn this. He would respect the discipline, the patience, the restraint. But he would also recognize the risk of over-reliance. When power comes only from what is hidden, visibility becomes dangerous. When influence depends on silence, openness becomes weakness. The collector must remain in the shadows to stay effective. They cannot afford to be fully known. Machiavelli would see how this isolates the collector over time, not emotionally, but strategically. They stand apart, not because they want to, but because their position requires distance. The collector may feel secure, untouchable, in control. Machiavelli would ask a final quiet question. What happens when everyone stops speaking? When the room learns to stay silent? When there are no new secrets left to gather? Power built on possession must always be fed, and feeding it changes the one who holds it. Until the next observation,